Hello and welcome to our live series with another established speaker. I'm George and I'll be your host today. And today we are discussing a very important topic, I would like to say so myself, with a very important person. So before we jump into things, I'd like to sort of give a quick introduction to the Green Career Center. At the Green Career Center, we are really excited about being able to bridge the gap for BIPOC youth and newcomers to be able to get green jobs, but most importantly, to discover certain aspects of different elements of the green career space. My guest today is Julius Lindsay. I wouldn't do justice introducing him, but he wears many hats: director, co-founder, mentor. But I'll sort of leave the space to him to introduce himself. And yeah, Julius, welcome. Tell us about yourself.
Thanks, George, and thanks for having me. I'm Julius Lindsay. I'm the Director of Sustainable Communities at the David Suzuki Foundation. The David Suzuki Foundation uses science and evidence-based research to help address sustainability challenges in Canada. My team, the Sustainable Communities team, boosts climate action and climate ambition in cities across the country. I'm also a co-founder of the Black Environmentalist Alliance, which is an organization that I helped found to um, support Black people who work in the environmental space, uh, uh, champion them, create a community for people to have real conversations and safe space, and also to address issues of environmental justice and environmental racism. And yeah, as you mentioned, I also mentor and coach and do many other things. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Nice. I find that with every sort of person in the environmental space, especially person of color, we're wearing so many different hats. So it's very tough to be attached to one thing, but also it's very real when it comes to the burnout of things. So I'm hoping that you're finding a balance with everything that's going on and taking time for yourself through it all.
Well, yeah, I'm on vacation this week, and it can be a lot of times, but
Hmm.
I think anybody who's in a movement to change the world like ours, it's always a balancing act to find that right balance between um, pushing for change, fighting hard, but also surviving the various challenges of living in our society. So,
Most definitely, most definitely. And I was for the second question, I personally know the story of how you got involved in the sector, but for our viewers that are really interested to hear more about you and how you got involved in the sustainability sector, could you please sort of share that with us?
sure, yeah, it's a bit of a funny story. I always like to tell it. So, when I finished school a very long time ago, I needed a job because I had student loans. So I got a job, and I got a job directly from a place that I had worked at during the summer many times. And so my educational background is physics and math. And so at the time, the Green Energy Act was coming out in Ontario, and there was a lot of sort of sustainability, energy management, and energy efficiency things happening. The government was trying to understand what its greenhouse gas footprint was, and as well, our the chair of our board of the organization that I was working at was wanted a sustainability report done for the organization. And so, literally one day, somebody walked up to me and was like, "Julius, you know math, you can do these greenhouse gas calculations." And I was like, "Oh, sure." And so I ended up getting involved in that work. And then from there, because the sustainability function was my group and I had a reporting function, I ended up being a co-lead on the sustainability report. And yeah, the rest is history. Just sort of grew my career from there.
I love that, being able to incorporate different energy aspects and the fact that, getting into the math part of things really ties into everything full circle. So it's really interesting to see that. I know with every job or every sort of sector or every endeavor that we get ourselves into, there's always a favorite and the least part of working in it. So I'm curious to hear from you, what is your favorite part of working and your least favorite part of working in the sustainability sector?
My favorite part of working in the sustainability sector is the cutting edge and innovation part of it. Like a lot of a lot of the work that I've done, or a lot of the stuff that I feel like is happening, is evolving every day, and it's sort of there's a cutting edge aspect to it, and being on the cutting edge um, of that work is really super interesting for me, and I've always found it interesting because climate change and sustainability is so interdisciplinary. Drawing from different disciplines to create solutions is really interesting to me. What's the least part of working in the sustainability sector? Being one of the very few people of color, and let alone Black people, who work in this space, and the challenge of constantly being erased, constantly being underestimated, constantly being um, taken for granted. I don't think it's too much to say that I have a pretty impressive resume and has done some really interesting work in my career, but it's still, I'm 16 years in my career, and I'm still um, fighting to have recognition for sort of my skills and my talents. And so I don't think that's ever going to change, just by the nature of who I am as a person. And that's my least favorite part.
It's very frustrating to have that challenge just because it's so systemic in its very nature. So it's a constant battle every single day. But with the work that you're doing, whether it be through a director, founder, or mentorship role, it really means a lot, especially to folks like myself. So thank you for all that you do.
No, I appreciate that. And I think that's the reason why organizations like yours and organizations like the Black Environmentalist Alliance, that's why they exist, because we need to make space for many different peoples in this movement.
Most definitely. So when talking about sustainability, I know every person has their sort of definition of what it means to them and how they sort of came into things. So I'm curious to sort of go back to your personal identity as identifying as someone, a Black person. How do you sort of incorporate that into sustainability and sort of merge into one identity for yourself? So sort of talking about what sustainability means to you, but through your lens, your personal lens, maybe even
Yeah, and
intersectional.
I think that's a great question. And I think, sustainability is about, like, the definition of the word sustainability is about um, having something that's long lasting. And I think that's where sustainability comes for me, is about um, ensuring that our society and who we are as a people is long lasting as possible. Because I don't think we will go on forever, but we want to make it as long lasting as possible. And I think that um, you know, through my lens, part of that is ensuring that everybody has a chance to be sustainable. We all need to participate. We all need to have a voice. We all need to be able to survive. And, our society is set up right now where many people lose and a few people win constantly. And I think sustainability is about writing that balance, and writing that balance not only between different peoples, but also writing that balance between people and nature. And that's what's really going to make us survive, and what is going to make our society, our lifetime sustainable.
I couldn't agree more with you on that. I know for this next question I have coming up, I always think of that song by Cher, If I Could Turn Back Time. What best career advice would you give to your younger self?
The career advice that I'd give to my younger self is that, like, don't take advocating yourself for granted. I think I can remember my first probably 5 years of working in my career. I was used to coming out of school, like, you work hard and you will be recognized. And, the workplace is nothing like that. And
Yeah,
so, I would tell my earlier self to be a bit more shameless in, I don't like the word promoting myself, but just recognizing what I've done, what my skills are, what my accomplishments are, and then making sure that others recognize that. And as we talked about a little bit earlier, as a Black person in the space, it's erasure is sort of the norm, the baseline. And so I think um, there's even more of an incentive to sort of raise the things that you've done or the skills that you have, to constantly combat that erasure. And I think I would have started earlier in my career combating that, because not to say that I've anybody held me back, but I think that erasure um, stagnated my career in the early years, and so I would have been more intentional about that in the beginning of my career.
It's really
And so
great.
that's what I would tell myself.
Nice. I have another question related to that time aspect, but I think I might skip that one just because you already answered it already. So I know with this next question, I know being able to continue to grow and learn as a leader. I want to preface it by saying I remember this scene in Queen and Slim when I first watched it in theaters, where they were both in the parking lot area, and he asks her, are you a good lawyer? And she says, I'm an excellent lawyer. And he says to her, why do Black people always have to be excellent? Why can't we just be ourselves? So then going into this next question, I want to know from you personally, why is it that we are always striving to have that excellent version of ourselves as opposed to just being ourselves normally?
Yeah, well, I think that that's a really super great question, and I think it's it has to do with that erasure, and it has to do with like stereotypes of like we are assumed to be um we are assumed to be lesser than, we are assumed to be criminals, we are assumed to be low life, and so in a way, even being average is being exceptional, like, or is being perceived as exceptional, like that's why somebody would, I've gotten people say to me, oh, Julius, you're so articulate. Like, I speak English at a, university level because I studied university. There's nothing exceptional about that. But like, because I'm a Black person, that is perceived as, oh, you're so articulate, oh, you're so exceptional, blah 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 blah. And so I don't think it's necessarily that we always have to be exceptional, but I think there's a certain, like, the bar starts lower for us, so normal seems exceptional. I think there's another aspect to it as well of, you need to be exceptional to be on par with others who are mediocre. And like,
Hmm.
I had this conversation with somebody recently. I spent most of the pandemic looking for a job, and before I got to the David Suzuki Foundation, and I had many conversations with people who were like, oh, well, you don't have the experience as a leader. But when I look back over my career, I can list you all the leadership experience that I have. I've been a coach, I've been a supervisor, I've had staff, I've hired staff, I've built teams. Like, I've done everything that a supervisor or a leader has done. um, but I'm still perceived as not being a leader. And so there's that aspect of, you have to be, 10, like, when I was young, my parents always told me, like, you got to be 10 better, 10 steps better than the next person to even get a shot against them. And so that is aspect is sort of very real and very prevalent in our society today. And so um, you know there is the aspect of, we being average is seen as exceptional, but also you need to be exceptional to compete against others who show up and have things given to them. And so I feel like there's two sides to the answer to that question.
Most definitely, and brings you back to the question of, or the answer of, working twice as hard for half as much, and it can be very frustrating just because we've been the systemic part of it, and it's being something that it's been happening for so long, and there's only every person has their breaking point, right? So it's very frustrating, but at the same time we're hopeful, but at the same time not overly optimistic that things will change.
And I think that's the reason, I said this the other day as well. I think that's the reason why often people are creating their own spaces. Like, that's the reason why the Black Environmentalist Alliance exists. That's the reason why the Green Career Center exists. Like, it's no longer about how do I find my space out there. It's like, how do I create my own space, and how do I create space for those that I want to support. And it's unfortunate that it has to get there, but we're kind of in a space where, like, that needs to happen, because um, it's we can no longer wait for somebody to give it to us. Like, to a certain extent, you have to take it.
Exactly, exactly. So, sort of moving on to the aspect of goals, I always say a goal without a plan is just a wish. So, for you personally, do you have any professional or personal goals sort of wrapping up the end of the year 2022?
Not any short-term goals. I mean, I have a longer-term goal of progressing as a leader. I'm a director now. I would like to move up into upper management, senior management as I grow my career. Um, I'm really interested in uh, creating more spaces and creating more work that centers Black people and Indigenous people in the climate space. And I'm working on some things to hopefully um, have that happen sooner rather than later. And I'm also really interested in and sort of have a I don't know if I would call it a goal, but I've done a lot of work in my career around innovative public engagement, um, innovative public engagement. And so I want to continue to innovate in that space and hopefully, it's a bit of a dream, but um, really change the way that we think about public engagement, particularly around how we think about people who are not centered in traditional public engagement. Traditional public engagement centers largely rich older people who mostly are white,
Yeah,
who have the confidence and the money and the time to be able to undertake certain activities. And so I'm really interested in how can we do that differently? How can we reach more people differently? How can we hear from voices? How can we get people engaged in issues that they would never choose to be engaged in normally? And so um, my overall like career goal, or maybe it's my why. I don't know if you've ever read the book Start with Why, but maybe my why is to really change um, the face of the way we think about public engagement, particularly in the climate space. Or maybe I should say one of my whys. I have many whys.
it's okay to have more than one. I love that. Bringing it back to your why. And I know it was sort of popularized, quote unquote, by Simon Sinek, but it always brings it back to the question of the purpose behind why you do what you do. So I think it's really important, and I'm glad you have more than one.
Well, it's I when I first read that book, I was really challenged with the concept because I was like, I don't really know what that means. But I think as I've had time to reflect on it, it's been interesting to think about how um, how the work that you do influences your life. And I think part of part of my work is inevitably about my why because of the fact that I am a Black person that works in the space. And so every day that I struggle or I'm challenged or I'm erased or all those things happen, it's always about um, like I have no choice but to try and do things differently. I have no choice but to try and think differently. I guess I do. I guess I could choose to sort of assimilate and take that on, but I choose not to. I choose to try and do things differently, to think differently, to help others, because this work is really about others. It's not about myself. Um, and so yeah, like that. I, understanding that kind of helps me understand what that start with why means.
I absolutely love that. Thank you for that, Julius. So, sort of moving on to the next question, let's sort of pretend as if we have, private sector, public sector, advocates, um, basically every person from every different branch of any industry in one room. What three steps or what three pieces of advice would you want to give them in order to really get things moving in the space from a more intersectional and inclusive perspective?
I think number one is thinking about who's not in the room and who you're not talking to. I think that's number one. I think oftentimes in the environmental space, especially, people think about like, this is what I have to say, as opposed to like, what do these people need to hear? And part of that reframing of like, what do people need to hear is understanding where they're at, what they're doing, what their culture is, who they are as a person. Like all of that needs to be informed by what do they need to hear. Because if we get stuck in the what do I have to say piece, we probably don't reach lots of people. And I'm not only talking about people who are climate deniers, blah, blah, blah. but I'm talking about people who may be disinterested. I'm talking about people who may not understand. I'm talking about people who just have a different context. And so reframing from what do I have to say to what do they need to hear is a real reframing of how we do this work. I lost my train of thought. I had a second point, but I think another point is around rethinking. Oh, that's what I was going to say. It's rethinking the way our society is structured. I think there's a lot of work that happens in the space that just sort of takes for granted that, this is the way it is, and this is the way it's all this is the way it always will be. Capitalism, colonialism, all these things are just, that's the way it is, and get over it. And so I think, we really have to start rethinking the the foundations of our society and the way that we operate, the way that we're structured, the way that things work. And if we don't do that, then we will continue on the path that we're on. There's that saying that you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. And that's what we're trying to do right now. We're trying to dismantle the master's house, climate change, with the master's tools of colonialism and capitalism. It's just not going to work. And so we have to think differently about the way that we operate within society. It's something that one thing that's really trendy in the climate movement right now is like traditional indigenous knowledge, and it's really important because it's a different way of thinking about the world. It's a different way of operating in the world. But part of that, if you really want to go down that route, is really embracing the foundations of that, and not just thinking that, oh, well, we're going to get some answers here, we're going to incorporate what we're doing, and then we're just going to go forward, and everything's going to be hunky-dory. Like, part of what Indigenous peoples in Canada are asking us to do is rethink our relationship to the land, rethink our relationship to them, rethink our relationships to our society. And I think, at a fundamental level, that's what we need to do to address climate change. That's what we need to do to achieve sustainability, is question our connections and question the fundamental way we operate in society. And if we don't do that, we will not achieve sustainability. I think the third one is really around, and I'm going to give it up to somebody I consider a friend, who's Saba Khan, one of the founders of Eco Muslims. She said this at a event we were at the other day, and I just loved the way she said it, which was pass the mic. And like, again, from that, your voice doesn't always have to be the most important voice in the room. Your voice doesn't always have to be the one that says what needs to be said. It's very easy to empower, to uplift, to promote, to magnify the voices of others in this movement, others who know better than you, who can say it better than you, who may think differently than you. And so, a really important part of this work and a really important part, I think, in our society right now, is around passing the mic and uplifting those who may think differently, uplifting those who have different challenges. I was in a space one time where somebody who's been in the environmental movement for a very long time was talking about the fact that progressives in Canada have for years never put forward challenges to the status quo, and the conservative movement in Canada has been really good at challenging the status quo and getting their message out there. And one of the things I said is that LGBTQ, BIPOC, disabled people in this movement have been putting up challenges to the status quo for years. It's just that their voices are not magnified, their voices are not heard, their voices are not valued in this movement. And so it's really important to magnify those voices, because they have something valid to say. They have different ways of doing things, and they have innovations that the people who are part of the majority of the movement in Canada, largely white people, probably have not heard, do not think, or have not seen. And so it's really important to pass the might and magnify those that may not always be heard, because there's so much value and richness in that in that space.
Most definitely. Being able to pass the mic, understand your privilege, but also giving that platform to other folks who have been left out of the spotlight for far too long. Thank you for that, Julius. I guess the final question I have for you is sort of for those of us who might be, may experience paralysis by analysis, and we're sort of thinking to ourselves, how do we make a difference, especially a positive one, in this big environmental movement? What piece of advice would you give to them, whether it be from a volunteer perspective, collaboration, or even just getting more involved in your different endeavors? What advice would you give to them in wanting to make a positive impact in the sustainability space?
You know, I to build off some of the things I said earlier, I would say just get out there and do it. Often when I'm mentoring students about work, I say, just get your foot in the door. And so I would sort of magnify to this to just, get out there and get involved. And, I I want to add on to that by saying that, you know, if you enter a space and it's not for you, it's okay to leave. It's okay to go to a different space. It's okay to create your own space. Like that's part of this work is don't settle for a certain space because you feel like you have to or you feel obligated. If it's not for you, it's not for you. And I think we started this conversation off talking about protecting yourself, protecting your energy,
Exactly.
sustainability, like your own personal sustainability.
Hmm.
Part of that is being selective about the spaces that you exist in and that you move in. And there are a lot of these spaces in these areas that are incredibly toxic.
Hmm.
And so, it's okay to say like this space is not for me and I'm going to leave it. And if you look hard enough and you don't find any spaces, it's okay to say I'm going to create my own space. There's enough space in this movement for everybody to create their own space and to work together. Um, and so I think that's a really important part of this work. I come from immigrant parents, and so from a very young age I had that kind of keep your head down and push through mentality kind of like bred into me. And it's only now that I'm realizing that like we don't have to put our head down and push through. That's not always, there are some times where you have to, but that's not always the right choice. And many times it's not the right choice. And so it's really important to sometimes not put your head down and push through and just say, this space is not for me. This energy is not for me. I cannot survive in this space and I'm going to walk away. And it's okay to do that. I mean, the challenge is urgent and people will push to say like, oh, it's so urgent. We can't rethink or we can't pivot or um, we can't challenge the status quo.
Hmm.
But when you think about it, like it's now 2022, in 2010, how many of us had a mobile computer in our pocket,
Yeah.
or even 15 years ago, how many of us had a mobile computer in our pocket? How many of us had a computer in our house? How many of us even knew what Netflix was? Like our world has changed so much in the past 5 to 10 years. There's nothing to say that our world can't change just as much in the next 5 to 10 years, but it takes a willingness to change. It takes a willingness to pivot. It takes a willingness to include voices that are not our own. I always use the example of like the guy who came up with the MP3. He
Hmm.
was watching an episode of Star Trek one day, and Captain Picard, I'm a big Star Trek fan, so Captain Picard was listening to music and like playing his flute while he's listening to the music on demand. And he was like, I want to be able to do that. And so, he wasn't somebody in the music industry. I don't think he was a computer person, but he went out and he created the MP3 and totally upended and changed the music industry within the matter of like 2 years. And this is an industry that's like 100 years old, and it had to change and pivot within 2 years, and is still recovering from that moment 20 something years later. And so if Star Trek had never made that episode, that guy would have never saw that and would never thought of that idea. And like he was not somebody in the music industry who was like a mover and shaker. And so it's really important to bring those non-typical voices, to bring those different ideas, especially from folks who are traditionally marginalized and and survival is a daily aspect of their lives,
Yeah.
to to bring their knowledge or incorporate them into this movement. But part of that is, as we talked about earlier, passing the mic, getting over yourself, getting over your own privilege, and really listening and embracing the ideas of others. And I think that's the only way forward and the only way that we really solve the crisis in front of us.
Very well said. Very well said. I did want to throw in a bonus question because I couldn't help myself. I saw this quick snapshot on your LinkedIn that it was from The Atlantic saying a person can't be diverse and why advocates are moving away from this theoretically helpful term. I'd love to hear more from you on this and in your personal thoughts.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The post was really around like, yeah, people cannot be diverse. Diverse is sort of an adjective, not a noun. And I really think it goes to that point around like people need to, like, everybody needs to be incorporated into the movement. We have to understand that when we talk about people being diverse, we are automatically centering whiteness, and there's many ways in our society that we center whiteness by default. And we don't have to center whiteness, and we don't have to take it as a default that whiteness is the default. And so we need to think of ways of thinking differently. Like, there are many people who I kind of cringed as I said BIPOC, because there's many people who oppose the term BIPOC, partially because it came from white people and from a basis of racism, from my understanding. I'm not an expert, but also because it sort of clumps everybody together, everybody who is not white together, and homogenizes their experiences, which their experiences are not homogenous. But also it centers whiteness, because it's saying that, all these people are not people, they're people of color. Right. And so just by default of having a term like that, we are centering whiteness. And I really think that, I've had to spend a lot of time sort of uncentering whiteness in my brain, uncentering some of these typical traditional ways of being and knowing and thinking and operating within the world. And I really think that's a journey that everyone should be on. Like, we all need to start thinking about, how do we uncenter whiteness in our minds, in our society, in our world? And that is a very challenging concept for many people. And just the idea of the fact that whiteness is centered in our society is appalling to many, or turns many people off. And you'll hear verses like, oh, that's divisive, or that's reverse racism, or whatever the case is. But the fact of the matter is that in society we center whiteness. And again, racial justice is climate justice, and we need to think differently about how we as I said earlier, how we construct, what are the foundations of our society built on, and how do we challenge those to get to the solutions we need to address the climate crisis, to address sustainability. And that's how these are intertwined. And so when you think about something like traditional Indigenous knowledge, or I have another person that I work with, a part of the Black Environmentalist Alliance, who does climate change and sustainability trainings, but to immigrants and using culturally relevant perspectives. Like, the amount of results she's been able to get is more than I've seen many people who traditionally work in this space are able to get. But that's because she's meeting those people where they are, and centering them in that work, and centering their experiences, centering where they come from, centering their culture. We cannot get to sustainability by trying to homogenize everybody. And because when we homogenize everybody, again, we center whiteness, and that ultimately has been proven not to work. And so we really need to think differently about how we approach this work, and how we approach people. Because really, another saying that I love to say is that climate change is not an environmental issue. It is a social issue with environmental consequences. And if we don't think about the environmental crises we're facing as a social issue, as about how do we get people to change and what are people doing to cause those issues, we're never going to solve them. And so um, part of that goes back to that issue of people are not diverse. We are all people, we're all part of society, and we need to center all of the voices and not center one way of being and then others are quote unquote different or exotic.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely love that. And you bring so much truth to everything that's been said. And I love the fact that your work is sort of amplifying everything that we've talked about today. So, Julius, thank you so much for joining me here today. I really do appreciate it. I'm sure the folks will enjoy having a listen or even just watching this conversation later on. And what's the best way for them to get in contact with you?
Best way to get in contact with me is find me on LinkedIn. You can just search my name, Julius Lindsay, with an A. And yeah, that's the best way to get in touch with me. Or you can follow the Black Environmentalist Alliance. It's BE Alliance _CA on both Twitter and Instagram. And we also have a website, bealliance.ca, that you can check out there. But yeah, if folks want to get in touch with me personally, the best way is to find me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on there.
Awesome. Julius, thank you so much for joining me here today. I really do appreciate it. And let's keep this going because it doesn't end over here. So thank you for all that you do.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It's been a great conversation.
Awesome.